Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. We are back again. It is year end. We're recording this in late December, although the episode, even though if you're listening way into the future, should be applicable or useful, should be evergreen. Today's topic should be interesting, and the reason we got we're bringing this up is because it's year end and people are thinking about all kind of tax deferring strategies. People are being retrospective about how the year went and what they want in the new year. So the topic essentially boils down to thinking about mortality, and the center of this episode will be the question that if you could know your death date, as in if you could know what year you're going to die, would you want to know it or not? Um, so, Stefan, do you have anything to add here before we get into the question?
Just surprised you overlooked the "in this world nothing is certain except death and taxes" quote, given that you're a man who loves quotes.
It's funny you say that because it's for like at work, at other places, people are constantly at year end thinking of all kind of incentives to defer taxes, as if in economics there is an idea of this consumption smoothing, right? So rather than being very poor at one point in life and being very rich, you wanna ideally have a glide path or some kind of smoothing of that.
Mhm.
You would think people would do like think about that, given that we seem to somehow imply that there is a tomorrow, and while there is a tomorrow, there one day will be wrong, right? Like we know one of those days we're going to be wrong and there will be no tomorrow. It'll be our last day on earth, and yet we always think about future. No matter how much in popular culture there's like YOLO and like you only live once or live in the
Yes.
moment and all that. Even then, like when I go to concerts or if I go anywhere, I see people taking this what I think is pretty much meaningless videos. I'm like, who's going to go back and watch this video
Yes,
years
exactly.
later? And maybe you will, maybe you won't. But if you're recording like 500 times in a year, like most likely you won't. Um,
Yep.
Along those lines. So the I started thinking about this because of taxes, because my friends started coming to me and like asking about, oh, like should I take like how do I lower my taxes this year? Maybe I should take some, like this tax loss harvesting and investing, which is my domain. There's always all kind of incentive provided by the employer, like remuneration deferment even. There's always the 401k Roth tactics and all that. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to the fact that you are going to live like you're implying a certain assumption on how long you're going to live. And I always tell people, life is about utility maximization or yeah, like happiness maximization, not tax minimization. That's what I say people. And like there's always the
Sure.
future cash that they prevent, and there's so many uncertainties even with tax law and where taxes could be deficit spending of the country and how taxes probably will be higher in the future anyways. Um, and all those there's inflation, which is also reducing your value of your future cash that you're storing away, and yet people are like spending so much time. I'm not saying it's a completely futile endeavor, but either way. So then that made me think like, okay, like if I'm a math guy at core, so I'm like this all would be optimized if we can know the death date. If I knew for certain I would live this, I would strategize differently versus
Yep.
today. So then that got me into thinking. So I guess I'll start with posing the question to you.
Yeah.
I can give my response, and then we can go from there. So yes, like,
Let's do it.
would you like to know if you could? Would you like to know when you die?
So, based on the information that you lay out there, I would say yes. Personally, that's my knee-jerk response. Just from the perspective of being able to plan for it. It can accelerate certain timetables. It can allow you to, cut away extraneous things. Because when you just work from the assumption that I'll live, you know, what the median expectation is based on what I see from family members or what I see from population research, yeah, what is the average lifespan for, a man, a married man living in America? at the age, you can do cohort ways. A lot of people will just look at, the population base rate, and that may be misleading. You want to look at, what's your natural cohort, what's your expected life, and then you can also compare, like, do I have especially long-lived relatives? Do I have especially short-lived relatives? And then you can kind of guesstimate where your life may fall. So we're playing that guessing game. So having certainty would, I think, provide me a more definitive plan on how I'd like to live my life. I think, obviously, if it's a very short period of time in the future, then obviously that's a tragedy from my perspective and of my loved ones. But what can you do?
If it was within 5 or 10 year, would your answer change? Like, let's say you don't know if it when it is, but let's say if you could choose to not know if it was within 5 to 10 years, would you change your answer then, or?
So if it's a lot more imminent, I do think that changes things, because then you're not necessarily living a typical life trajectory if your life is going to end prematurely, so to speak, and that would change. I think that I would move a legacy play to front and center, and what I mean by that is I'm thinking about what can I do to maximize my impact on my own family, in terms of the future that I would like to give them, and then maximize my impact, like, on society as a whole. And those things would be my focus if it was on a very short time span. And so we assume, again, this kind of circles back to the finance, that you would want to do everything you can to assure financial and material security for your loved ones. And so that would be the first focus. And then after that, or perhaps maybe before that, is the emotional and psychological legacy that you'd like to leave. But I have some ambivalence about that, in terms of you don't know what the future will bring for your loved ones. You don't necessarily want to be a domineering presence in their future when you're not even there. You want to leave some impact, of course. You want to be remembered and so on, but it feels very selfish if you're the one that's no longer there, to be the one that then is directing their future life choices. So I think you have to find a sweet spot on that question. I'm not sure exactly what it would be, but
yeah. And to our listeners, it might seem like, oh, what a stupid question, like what a stupid hypothetical, like why are we spending time on something that is realistically we're never gonna get a chance to know this. And of course, despite all the demographic stuff you say, it leaves out accidents. Like, there's always accidents. You leave your home, you get hit by something, and then boom, done. Like, so it might seem like, oh, why are we even spending time on this? But if we dial back, the same question I asked to older people who are a little bit older, like, in their 70s, 80s, I asked the same question in a different way a little bit, is that how much of your net worth would you be willing to give up to add 5 years to your lifespan, or like to go back 5 years in time? Meaning your knowledge doesn't go back or anything. It's just like to extend healthy 5 years or 10 years along those lines, right? And it's important to ask the question in a net worth perspective, because of course the answer for Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos would be different than for average Joe. But that all being said, as a percentage of net worth, maybe it shouldn't be that much different, or all that. And God knows they would be willing to spend billions of dollars to extend even 1 year of their life, or to keep them frozen for 1 year, whatever, like however you want to think about this. So, and if we think about it, a lot of us are, generally speaking, trading our time for money, right? Like when we do jobs, any jobs, and hopefully you have a job that you enjoy. Thankfully, I believe I do. I enjoy it. So, and that when you have the choice, and you would see, like, I would still allocate some of my time to doing this. So that's how you're in a job you enjoy. But for majority of us, we're trading time for money at some perspective. So indirectly, this question could be posed in that way, right? Like, if you would spend more than, like, your annual in-pocket salary after tax to extend your life, then why not just live it to the extent you can afford it? Of course, there's affordability issues and all that. So for me, I mean, knowledge is power. So I thought, like, my initial answer would have also been like, yes, I want to know. Knowledge is power. I can solve for it then. That's one less variable, and like that can be changed to a constant or something that I know, giving me accuracy in forecasting. However, after discussing this with a few friends, some made me ask like to think of it in a stepwise function in that, okay, let's say if it is in 5 years or 10 years, would I really be better off knowing? Because that would always be hovering on my mind, and I would be thinking, oh, I'll miss my daughter's high school graduation, I'll miss her college graduation, yada yada, along those lines. Like you'll be clouded with all the things you would miss, and like I don't know if you could truly even enjoy it. Although the other camp would be, hell, if I knew I could, like it's 10 years and I know like maybe financially I'd be fine, or like even you could even game by taking insurance policies, I suppose, life
Indeed,
insurance
indeed.
policies and
Yeah.
all that, and solve for the financial issues that way. And you're like, you know what? Now I don't want to spend an hour. A minute seems crazy to say, but like an hour a day that I don't want to live like that. I'm actually living every day like it's my last day, kind of thing.
Right.
So I would max, like I would have as much non-recourse debt as I could take, as long as it doesn't go back to my loved ones.
Exactly.
Um, I would take out as much life insurance policy I could do. I could solve that within like a day or two, and then boom, like live 10 years. But then there's of course the psychological element of it.
Yeah.
So then, like that makes you think the next step is like, okay, if it's not in the next 10 years, and I'm 30 something, right, for our listeners' purposes. So if it's not in the next 10 years, but it's within 10 to 20, would you really do any 10 to 30 even? Would you really do anything differently?
Mhm.
Because that seems far enough that you still wanna maybe I would be okay eating unhealthy because I'm like I'm gonna die of other causes, so I don't need to be fit. So maybe I would be. I consider myself a reducitarian, but maybe have. But I do enjoy occasional meat. Maybe I enjoy increase the frequency of it. Now, then, if you go the further out, and let's say it's not even in 30 years, so it's past 60, then what value is that knowledge kind of thing? Maybe as I age, there's value to it, but what would you really do differently? You know. And if it's very short, like on the other spectrum, if it's in a couple years, at least eating wise, I would eat whatever I want. I would eat a pint of ice cream every day. Enjoy all the like or joyful or things that come with without consequences.
Uh-huh.
While I know it would cloud me, and I don't know if my overall quality of life would be good, but I would at least have some cheats in there, like to do that. So it's an interesting question. Like we hope like our listeners like would comment on the show. We're curious on what like your situation, and if you would want to know this or not as well.
Yeah. I like the framing about the thinking about it as a stepwise function. If it's 5, if it's 10, if it's
Yeah,
15, if it's 30. I think that's a good
yeah,
way to think about it. It shows you how the question can evolve as the time frames change. And it does seem that when it's on the shorter time frames, that there's some tendency, especially when you ask this, of people to default towards a cynical mode or a hedonistic mode, and so they're looking for how can I get as much pleasure in the small window that I have left, or things are terrible and there's no purpose to anything, so I'm just going to again maximize pleasure. So it kind of
yeah,
folds into those, and the way I look at that response is I've sort of a knee jerk revulsion to it because at least personally I would hope that I wouldn't take that perspective if I was in that position. I think I would still, in a lot of ways, want to live my life the way I live my life today, because it makes sense that I should be doing what I care most about now, regardless of however much time I have, especially with respect to my loved ones. Now, we still, because of the financial question and everything, have to play the long game in the ways that we're expected to.
yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, ideally you do that, but there's always that exam that you would otherwise not take if you know it wasn't for long term. It's a long term investment, right?
yeah,
A
sure.
certification exam, maybe even maybe if it was earlier in life, maybe that PhD that you wouldn't get, maybe. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's
There's
true.
always elements of life that in a macro, like high level, hopefully people are heading the way they want to.
Yeah.
But there's always days or hours that you have to spend doing things you don't want to do. And that's where like this what is the exchange rate, right? Like
Yeah.
everyone's exchange rate is different, like in terms of time to dollar. And we actually learned in economics when I was a broke student. When I learned the concept, it seemed very foreign that you trade time for money, the inflection point, because and so like
Mm.
at one point you do that trade off is what we were taught, and so like knowing this would definitely help
Right.
people with that, determining their own exchange rate, pegging it almost like this is my exchange rate, so like I'm not going to do XYZ along those lines. I know you wanted to tie this all these topics to some of the philosophical concepts as
Yes.
well. So yeah, how do you want to go about that?
Well, I thought these concepts were relevant because, like I was saying, it's almost like when death comes into the picture, it's almost like we should just, even if we knew, we should still pretend like we don't know, and that we should live our lives in the same way, because theoretically you should just have the same outlook, same, like, whatever your philosophy is of moral behavior, it should be unaffected by that moment in time. I think in an ideal way, but of course it's not. And then some people argue that, like, the very thing that gives human life meaning is the fact that death exists, and if we live forever, then time would have no value, and so on. But I think even if that's the case, even if, say, there was some sort of form of immortality, I think questions of time would still matter. Like, there still would be a developmental trajectory. I think history would still be occurring. There would still be moments of time. We wouldn't be able to, like, reverse and go back to previous moments. So it seems like mortality itself isn't necessarily the whole reason that life has meaning. It does create a level of urgency, though. So, but again, I still circle back to this question of, presumably people have a moral outlook, a metaphysical or a religious or spiritual vision of their life, and that it may be interwoven with the reality of death, or it may be something that transcends that reality.
Yeah, no,
And
I do
so,
wonder, like, if everyone in the world knew, like, they were born with expiry date, just like
mm,
produce, right? How would that change our morality or ethics, right? Like,
right.
maybe certain people who, let's say, have not know their, and how much would of that be self-fulfilling too? But like,
Mm,
if you're gonna die in 6 months and you don't have the resources to enjoy or anything, then you're like, what would you do? Like, would you be willing to commit crimes that you otherwise would not be?
mm.
Like, would there be a moral decay of society as a whole because
Yeah.
everyone is thinking only about themselves in a way? Because when we think about long term, we think as a whole, right? Like utility maximum. There's utility maximization for for everyone as a whole.
Mm, mm.
Um, but I don't know if I can tie this to the repugnant conclusion in that sense that
No, but so to circle back to your point about, like, if everyone knew their expiration date, would that create a social chaos? Like, would the moral questions be thrown out the window, and everyone just become these utility maximizing agents without conscience, right? Like, we say we have this, we're dancing around this, the idea of utilitarian ethics, which is like providing the most good to most people. But
hmm
when we think about this from an individualist perspective, we're just thinking about what provides me the most good,
yeah,
or what provides me and my loved ones the most
yeah,
good. And then there's a tension between you and the collective. And
yeah,
so that's why there is this field of philosophy called population ethics. And they try to think about what are the right decisions for groups of people. Because the way we've always thought it on the individual scale, if we knew something like the expiration date of our life, and there was this desperate urgency to maximize your utility within a short span of time, people would be induced to engage in desperate and dangerous or risky behaviors because of that, and that would upset the trajectory of society. And that's why, I mean, we're kind of all over the place, but I wanted to circle back to the idea that perhaps, like, religion itself was one of these mechanisms that was used to enforce or create a sort of population ethic without thinking about it in this rationalistic, mathematical, or economic way. Where they would take death off the table, they would say, at least in the Christian tradition, they say, if you follow the moral strictures of the church, of Christian teaching, then your life will be everlasting.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that then creates this psychological perspective where one is able to tolerate a great deal of pain during their life, thinking that this is only one moment in time, it will pass, and there's this heaven and paradise beyond, etc. And so we live in a very secular world today, and so that sort of social control mechanism, for lack of a better word, is sort of ebbing or fading away. And so for someone who is, without religious belief, what are the things that one tells oneself in order to not become a utility monster and do things that harm others? Because there has to be some balance between the individual and the group as a whole. And and that's what, circling back then to population ethics tries to answer that question. But what happens is when you think about these ethical questions at a population scale, you start running into these weird paradoxes and weird quandaries where, like, you're starting to think about things in ways that are very alien and counterintuitive. And so that's where that then provokes a level of disgust and revulsion in the people who hear these things. They think, like, oh, these people are amoral monsters who are coming up with these, like, extremely utilitarian philosophies. For instance, there was all this talk about the effective altruist movement during the time when there was the scandal around Sam Bankman-Fried. And that specifically refers to the idea of long-termism in effective altruism, which is a branch of effective altruism, which is primarily concerned about avoiding catastrophic or events that would pose an existential risk to humanity. So something like creating artificial intelligence, superhuman intelligence, that then poses a risk to humanity because its goals are not aligned with human goals, or pandemics that would cause sufficient destruction, maybe not wipe out all human beings, but would cause sufficient destruction that it would set human civilization back in a significant way. Or even something like fertility crisis, where just not having enough human beings so that we can't pass down the technology and quality of life that we have created through the progress that we've seen historically. We can't continue to pass that on because we haven't created a sufficient number, a critical mass of future generations in order to pass that prosperity down. So that's the kind of questions long-termism would ask. And part of the question there that Sam Bankman-Fried was supposedly practicing was the, quote, earning to give model that he was trying to run FTX and his crypto exchange to make as much money as possible to then give it to good causes. And that's the way he's contributing.
I think, there's a idea of arbitrage there, isn't there? Like there was a irony, or maybe not, in that the way he created his wealth originally was by arbitraging the value of Bitcoin in Japan and US, and so selling at a place where it's selling for high, buying at a place that's low, and that translates to effective altruism, as in, if that same dollar that you spend or give is going to, if we ascribe same value to your human life all over the world, then that money should be spent where it has the highest, like, we can frame it in terms of saving lives, right? Like, so, like, you sacrificing one meal in America maybe is enough, and is enough to save one life somewhere else, or maybe like one Christmas gift is willing to save someone's life, but yet we do not do that on a daily basis. And that's where, like, the repugnant conclusion maybe ties into, but you tell me. But I really like was that Peter Singer's Shallow Pond, where, like, if we as humans, if you're passing by and you see a child drowning in a shallow pond, you have no risk of drowning yourself. You would jump in and save that child, and the only cost to you would be your wet clothes that need to be either dry cleaned or something. So let's call it, for $25, you would go through the pain of jumping in a shallow pond and saving a child when you're walking by, because it would almost be, I don't know if it would be outright illegal, but it's just like, it's a no-brainer, right? Like, we do it immediately. Like 99.99%, I like to think of us would do it without a second's thought.
Yep.
But then, like, if we do think far away in other countries, like people are dying out of hunger or diseases that we have already known the cure of, and all that same dry cleaning spend, not all of us, despite being incented by tax deductions and all, will give because it's not happening in front of us, and we can choose to mute it. So then, like, why do we not do that? Like, when one thing is so no-brainer, but the other thing is not that far-fetched, like, if you think about it, that's also saving lives here and there, but not everyone does that. Um, is the argument. So if you truly would do the first one, you should do the second one too. Now the slippery slope argument is, if you keep going down that route, at some point the whole world like would be like at a certain above average where no one is truly living above a certain point, but everyone is living, the average is like everyone's living around that average. You'd keep doing it until you couldn't. So how many lives do you stop at, and all that? And so that's how do you address that? How do you tie that to what we're talking about?
Right. I think those are all important questions, because I do think when you take that strict mathematical way of saying my money can save more lives abroad somewhere or some other place, or if I give to this place versus this place, it's going to save more lives, and that's why it's the right decision to make. There's all the second order, third order, and so on questions of what happens because of that. What if you were going to take that money and invest it in a company that goes on to cure cancer or something like that? You know what I'm saying? Like there's all
Or
these
like
like
even more realistic is like, yeah, exactly, like you deny, like, because at the end again goes to time and money and equals and then say money can save life, which is time again, kind of thing. So if you could then, instead of taking a day off to spend with your children, then it is imperative on you to go work whatever you can, like to make that extra dollar to donate or give to someone else to save someone's life. You are not supposed to take days off on your child's birthday, or like if the child wants to spend more time with you, you say no, I need to go work so I can give money to save. And so ultimately, this whole like discussion, I think the thread that ties all this discussion is the exchange rate of time, money, and knowing when your exchange rate is changing as you age, as your values change, and then also like in terms of saving like lives elsewhere, same thing, how much of your time is equal to money, and then how easy is that money. Some of us would be more fortunate than others, and so everyone has a different exchange rate, but sometimes we go on with life without thinking about it on a like year to year basis, let alone day to day.
Yeah. I worry that when we extend these questions in this way, these sort of basic moral questions, I'm like, what do you owe your neighbor, or what do you owe other people, to extending it to things like what do we owe the world population, or what do we owe the future, which is a book title about the philosophy of long-termism, is we take it to a spot where we're ultimately trying to solve questions that have to do with subjective well-being a lot of times. I mean, some of them have very objective measures, like they will starve to death, or someone is imperiled because of political violence, or something of that matter. And like potentially those problems can be solved by money, but a lot of times money itself doesn't solve those problems. There was this people are thinking that what if we live in we currently live in a pretty close to, at least in very modern nations, an almost post-scarcity world, in terms of like people can do a lot of things wrong, mess up in a lot of ways, but they're most likely in a country like America, they're most likely not going to starve to death in penury. They're going to find some way to limp on and survive in a lot of ways, even if it's not necessarily the best life that they could be living. So the question is, why are we still plagued by a lot of the same problems if we lived in a world where everything was solved, a sort of utopian world from a material perspective? Would that really prevent all wars? Would it really prevent all misery? And the question is almost certainly not. We'd have plenty of the same problems. And so it's something essentially about human psychology, where we're prone to ennui, we're prone to boredom, we're prone to be satiated. You can only go so far. There's a sweet spot for the amount of pleasure you can experience. So the question is like, like what is, again, it just circles back to this very basic question. We can figure out on a local level, what do we owe? I think, like, what do we owe our families or our loved ones or our friends? I think those are questions that can be answered, and we don't have to think too much about what the secondary, tertiary consequences of making those decisions that benefit them. Usually, they're not going to come at too great a cost of other people. And so we should do the things that benefit them. But when we start thinking about, like, how do my actions affect the world, or can I spend, if I spend this money on this charity versus that charity, or so on? I think these questions have so much uncertainty that it's almost like, are we wasting time asking them? And should we just focus more parochially on our lives? At least our moral intuitions work on that level.
Yeah. No, at least on your first question, what do we owe to every, like, XYZ neighbor, family? Generally, I like to live my life with this equation of satisfaction equals perception minus expectation. So generally, like, if you can manage to keep expectations low, and we see this in sports all the time, right? Like, which is like, even if the team is doing well, they say, "Oh no, we're not contenders yet," blah blah blah. So it's like, we see that, and then same in real life, like we get upset with the people that are closest to us, right? We're not mad generally with someone we know on the fringes, because we have very low expectations of them. People who we have high expectations of, when those are disappointed, leads to dissatisfaction. So I think to the society as a whole, and like to our loved ones, we like a moral, half decent human being that does not affect others' life adversely. And then beyond that, you go live your life, and within you can think of your family as one unit, like live like your life the way you want, as long as your choices and decisions are not adversely affecting others. Hopefully not, polluting the environment to an outrageous amount, like disproportionately, or doing anything, because there would be people who, because of the value of their sheer wealth or power, could in theory do that. So as long as you're not doing that and violating the laws, and hopefully you're above average moral person, I think that's good enough. That's the way. Then, like, if everyone does that, everyone's expectations are set accordingly, and generally people leave satisfied life.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking
By
about
the
how
way,
the brain works. You're talking about how the brain works, right? That's how
sure, yeah. At the end of the day, it's all what
system.
perception, right? Like, yeah. No, I'm with you,
It's
because
true.
at the end of the day, it's all, even pleasure, like what we're talking about, right? These hedonistic pleasures we're talking about is just probably chemicals in the brain at the end of the day. And like you said, there's a limit after which boredom kicks in and all that. And if the firemen like back in the day, if we had salt for fire, food, and other things, and would be satisfied, would never have the world that we have today, and like would not constantly seek for progress, because at different point in history we reached points where, like, wow, this is great, and clearly there was more to go if we wanted to. But again, like, yeah, dialing back to everything, and trying to wrap this up for today, just quickly, we started with, would you like to know your death date, if you could? Genesis of the question was because of year-end tax strategies and other things people are doing to defer the money that they could enjoy today into future, just so they save on taxes, which implicitly assumes that you live a certain expected life, which a fair amount of time would like unfortunately won't be true. So then, like, I like to think like life is about happiness maximization, not tax minimization, and so that's how we started asking these questions. Some movies we can talk about, recommendation for people to explore these ideas on their own. I recently watched My Old ASS, or Aubrey Plaza. This is an Amazon Prime. Like, where you see your future self. I'm not going to give any spoilers. And then, like, how would you, even though you knew certain things were going to happen down the road, would you live your life differently today? I thought it was you would think from the movie title, it's not as deep of a movie, but I really liked it. There's another one called Past Lives. This is in Paramount. And I think you have a couple classic ones too, right?
Yeah. So this conversation made me think about Groundhog Day. And so I think most listeners are probably familiar with it, or most people are familiar with Groundhog Day because it's an older, famous movie starring Bill Murray, where essentially he's living the same day over and over and over again for an interminable amount of time. And so it's not quite the same question as, well, the date of your death, but it's asking the question, if you live in essentially in an interminable present where your ability to see novel and new pleasurable stimuli is fairly limited, how should you live your life? I think it's sort of a examination of like certain Stoic philosophies or something of that variety, and it's an interesting thought experiment as a movie that also is a heartwarming movie as well as funny because it stars Bill Murray. So I think that's one worth checking out if people haven't seen that one. I think that's one that's relevant.
If you've been living under a rock or were in a prison and just got out, yeah, that's something to check out. And then there's the bucket list, which then also, of course, like this question is not as hypothetical for some people who have been medically diagnosed with terminal diseases and do have knowledge of roughly of how long they're going to live. That's one. I wonder if any academic studies have been done with that population to see what they did differently or anything like that. So that would be something to dig into for people who are interested even more. And like maybe we should as well for down the road if we have another episode to tie this lose question that we asked. But yeah, on that note, unless you have anything to add, hopefully it was not as morbid for people. We can ask the same question in a different way if you want to ask it in a playful way. It's like I said, how much money would you or net worth would you give up to extend your life 5 years, or to be the same for freeze yourself for 5 years, health wise, cell wise, everything wise. And that way it leads.
I do have a funny one, I think. So that I saw this article that was writing about Ethan Hunt, who is the protagonist played by Tom Cruise of the Mission Impossible series, right? And the title of the article is that Ethan Hunt is not a utilitarian. and so I thought it was posing an interesting question about how to watch the Mission Impossible movies and think about the moral decisions that Ethan Hunt is making with respect to, basically think about what the downside of some of the risks he decides to take for the sake of his basically close compatriots, his colleagues, and so on. And so, for instance, I think it's worth reading a little bit of this. He says, the series focuses on the adventures of the Impossible Mission Force led by Ethan Hunt. Hunt is the anti-James Bond. He works with a team, cares deeply about them, is married. He does separate from his wife, but for concerns around her safety, he doesn't sleep around. He's serious, intense, prone to long and thoughtful stares. He's never made a wisecrack. Hunt can be emotional, getting choked up about the people he loves if they're in harm's way. He's polite, calling his superiors sir and ma'am, even when there's complicated double cross, triple crosses going on. He tells people how much he cares about them, and he apologizes a lot. He's surrounded by his team, and he's always crying and apologizing to his ex-wife. But he goes on to protect the people that he loves. He makes all these decisions where he's potentially risking the end of the world for the benefit of these people. And so it kind of takes these questions from population ethics to this extreme. But we all root for Ethan Hunt, right? So we find his ethical behavior. We found his behavior very ethical, and we root for him, even though some of the effective altruists or other utilitarian-minded people would probably look at this behavior as abominable or extremely risky and reckless in some respects. And so, it's a funny way to watch Mission Impossible.
I don't know if you ruined Mission Impossible for a lot of people or not. I don't know that. Maybe our audience can let us know in the comments as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, hopefully this was at least thought-provoking for people, and maybe you can write to us with your thoughts on this.
Sounds good. Thank you, Manju.
Thanks, guys. Bye.